What makes us fall in love? Is it the way someone looks, the size of their bank account, or is it something deeper, like the kindness in their heart? Life has a funny way of answering these questions when we least expect it. This is a story about love found in the most unexpected place, a rainy street in Boston. It's about a young woman who had nothing but a golden heart and a blind man who seemed to have even less. But things aren't always what they seem to be. The rain fell steadily over Boston that October morning, turning the red and orange leaves into a wet carpet on the sidewalks. Emma Foster was on her knees, scrubbing the marble floors of Mrs. Henderson's brownstone on Beacon Hill. Her back ached, and her hands were red from the hot water, but she kept working. The rent was due next week, and she needed every penny she could earn. "Just 3 more houses to go," she whispered to herself, wringing out her cleaning cloth. At 24, this wasn't where she had planned to be, but life had other ideas after her mom got sick. Now it was just Emma, her cat Mr. Whiskers, and endless floors to clean. Through the tall windows, she could see people hurrying past with their umbrellas and fancy raincoats. That's when she noticed him, a tall man in worn-out clothes, standing perfectly still in the rain. His eyes were closed, and he held a white cane in one hand. Water dripped from his dark hair onto his face, but he didn't seem to care. Emma watched as business people walked right past him, some even bumping his shoulder without stopping to say sorry. The man never moved, never complained. He just stood there, getting soaked to the bone. Something in her chest tightened. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Kindness doesn't cost anything, Emma, but its value is priceless." She looked at her watch. She was already running behind schedule. Mrs. Peterson would be angry if she was late again. But how could she just walk away? For Emma Foster, that simple question would lead to an extraordinary journey. Tell us where you're watching from and share your thoughts on Emma and Jamie's love story. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that kindness always pays off. Emma wiped the sweat from her forehead and stood up slowly, her knees cracking from hours of scrubbing floors. The cleaning supplies in her worn bucket clinked together as she gathered her things. The blind man was still there, rain soaking through his thin jacket. 20 minutes behind schedule or not, she had to help. That's what her mother would have done. Life hadn't been easy for the Fosters. Emma grew up in a small apartment in Dorchester, where her mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Their apartment might have been tiny, but it was always filled with love and laughter. Her mother, Linda Foster, cleaned houses during the day and waited tables at night, somehow still finding time to help Emma with her homework and cook proper Sunday dinners. "We might not have much," her mother used to say, "but we've got something better than money. We've got each other." But 2 years ago, cancer took her mother away. Emma had to drop out of community college, where she'd been studying to become a social worker. She took over her mother's cleaning jobs, determined to keep their little apartment, the only home she'd ever known. Now her only company was Mr. Whiskers, an orange cat she'd rescued from the rain last winter. He was missing an eye and had a crooked tail, but Emma loved him all the more for his imperfections. Every morning, Emma woke up at 5 a.m., packed her cleaning supplies, and took the T from Dorchester to Beacon Hill. She cleaned 6 houses a day, sometimes 7 when someone needed extra help. At night, she studied for her online classes, determined to finish her degree someday. Her mother's dream of seeing her daughter graduate might not have come true, but Emma wasn't going to give up. Now, looking at the blind man in the rain, Emma remembered all the times strangers had helped her and her mother when times were tough. The neighbor who brought them groceries during her mother's chemo. The kind bus driver who waited an extra minute when he saw them running for the bus. The library lady who let Emma study past closing time. Emma grabbed her umbrella and walked out of Mrs. Henderson's house. Her next client, Mrs. Peterson, would just have to understand why she was late today. Some things were more important than clean floors. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, walking towards the blind man. "Would you like to share my umbrella?" The man turned his head slightly at the sound of her voice. Despite his shabby clothes, there was something about the way he held himself, a kind of quiet dignity. His unseeing eyes were a striking blue-gray, like the ocean after a storm. "That's very kind of you," he said softly, his voice surprisingly warm and gentle. But I wouldn't want to make you late for anything. Emma smiled, even though she knew he couldn't see it. Sometimes being late for the right reason is better than being on time for the wrong one. She didn't know it then, but those words would echo in both their hearts for years to come. The rain had stopped by the time Emma finished her cleaning jobs that evening. Her shoulders ached, but she felt good about helping the blind man, who'd introduced himself simply as Jamie, find a dry spot under the awning of a coffee shop. She'd even shared half of her peanut butter sandwich with him. "Where do you live, Jamie?" Emma asked, watching him take small, careful bites. "Do you need help getting home?" "Don't worry about me," he said with a gentle smile. "I manage okay. Been blind for 3 years now. You learn to adapt." That was all he ever said about his condition, and Emma didn't push. She understood what it was like to want to keep some things private. Over the next few weeks, Emma found herself leaving her apartment earlier each morning. Her days were lonely. Just her cleaning supplies, and various employers who barely noticed her beyond the shine of their floors. Having someone to talk to, even for a few minutes, made her long days feel lighter. Jamie was always at the same corner, sometimes playing an old guitar. His music wasn't particularly good, but had heart. Emma would stop, share whatever snack she'd packed that day, and tell him about Mr. Whisker's latest antics or her struggles with online classes. "Why are you so kind to me?" Jamie asked one morning, as they shared a coffee she'd bought with her spare change. Emma thought about her empty apartment, about eating dinner alone every night, about having no one to call when things got tough. "Everyone needs a friend," she said simply, and honestly, I needed one too. What Emma didn't notice were the signs that Jamie wasn't quite what he seemed. The expensive leather of his worn boots, the way his old guitar was perfectly tuned, the black car that appeared each day, parking just far enough away to avoid attention. Inside sat a man in an expensive suit, watching their interactions with growing concern, speaking quietly into a phone. One Tuesday morning, Jamie wasn't at his usual spot. Emma felt a pang of worry. Not romantic feelings, but genuine concern for someone who'd become her only friend. When she passed by again that evening, she found him there, his clothes damp but wearing a familiar smile. "I was worried," Emma admitted. "I don't have your phone number or know where you live. If something happened to you, I wouldn't even know." "Trust me," Jamie said, his unseeing eyes facing forward. "I'm not worth worrying about, but thank you for caring anyway." As Emma walked away to her next cleaning job, the black car pulled away from the curb. Inside, the man in the suit spoke into his phone. "Mr. Blackwood's brother calling. We need to talk about the situation. It's getting complicated." Later that evening, in a luxurious office overlooking Boston Harbor, Richard Blackwood paced in front of his younger brother's desk. "Jamie, this has gone too far. You're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, not some street musician. And it's pretending to be blind. It's ridiculous." James opened his eyes fully, watching his brother pace. He removed the special contacts he wore to make his striking blue-gray eyes appear clouded. "3 months, Richard. 3 months of people walking past me like I'm invisible. Then this cleaning lady stops, shares her lunch, talks to me like I'm human. Not a charity case, not a wealthy man, just human." "The board is getting nervous," Richard continued. "The press is asking questions about your absence, and now there's rumors about the mysterious blind man on Beacon Hill. How long before someone recognizes you?" James's fingers traced the edge of his desk, a habit he'd developed while pretending to be blind. The same hands that had held Emma's simple sandwiches now touched smooth mahogany worth thousands. "Just a little longer," he said quietly. "I need to know." "Know what?" "If she's different." Richard stopped pacing. "Brother, she's cleaning houses for a living. Once she finds out who you really are." "That's exactly why I can't stop now," James interrupted. "Everyone else in my life, they all want something. Money, power, connections. Emma," he smiled slightly, "Emma gives me her lunch money to buy coffee." Meanwhile, across town in her small apartment, Emma was making extra sandwiches for tomorrow. Mr. Whiskers wound between her legs as she worked in her tiny kitchen. The bread was from the day-old basket at the grocery store, but she'd splurged on good cheese this time. "You know what, Mr. Whiskers?" she said, carefully wrapping the sandwiches in wax paper. It's nice having someone to talk to besides you. Jamie actually listens. He doesn't care that I'm just a cleaning lady. She didn't notice the newspaper on her counter, turned to the business section. There, beneath her grocery list, was a headline: Reclusive Blackwood Technologies CEO continues mysterious absence from public eye. The accompanying photo was 3 years old, showing a man with striking blue-gray eyes at a charity gala before the accident that took his sight. The next morning, Emma found Jamie at his usual spot. As she approached, she noticed his clothes seemed different, still worn, but the fabric looked expensive despite the tears. Before she could think about it too much, he turned toward the sound of her footsteps and smiled. "I brought you something different today," she said, pulling out the sandwiches. "Real cheese, not the processed stuff." "You shouldn't spend your money on me," Jamie said, but accepted the sandwich gratefully. "Friends take care of each other," Emma replied simply. She didn't see the pain that flashed across his face at the word friends, or the black car parked across the street where Richard Blackwood watched with growing concern. As Emma hurried off to her first house of the day, a man with a camera stepped out from behind a nearby tree. The quiet click of his shutter would soon cause ripples neither Emma nor Jamie could predict. The photo appeared in the Boston Herald 3 days later. Mystery woman befriends street performer on Beacon Hill. It wasn't front page news, just a small article in the local section, but it caught the eye of Mrs. Peterson as she sipped her morning coffee. "Emma," Mrs. Peterson called out as Emma scrubbed her kitchen floor. "Isn't this you in the paper?" Emma stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the photo. There she was, sharing her sandwich with Jamie. The article was simple enough, a feel-good story about kindness to strangers. But something about seeing their private moments in print made her stomach twist. That afternoon, when Emma reached Jamie's corner, something was different. Two men in dark suits stood nearby, pretending to read newspapers. Jamie was there, playing his guitar as usual, but his shoulders were tense. "Jamie?" she called out softly. "Is everything okay?" "Emma," he said, turning toward her voice. "We need to talk. Not here. Would you trust me enough to go somewhere more private?" Emma hesitated. Despite the strange men watching them, Jamie was still her friend. "Okay," she said finally. The men led them to a sleek black car. Emma's heart pounded as they drove to a quiet cafe, one far fancier than any she'd ever entered. In a private room at the back, Jamie sat across from her. "What I'm about to tell you," he started, then stopped. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his dark glasses. "I've been lying to you, Emma, about everything." Slowly, he removed his glasses. His blue-gray eyes focused directly on her, clear, sharp, and very much able to see. Emma felt the air leave her lungs. "My name is James Blackwood. I'm the CEO of Blackwood Technologies." His voice was different now, deeper, more confident. "I'm not blind. I'm not poor. Everything you've seen, it was all a lie." Emma sat there frozen as James told her everything. How he'd grown tired of people only wanting his money. How he'd created this experiment to find someone genuine. How he wore special contacts to make his eyes look clouded. How he'd learned to move like a blind person. How the guitar was just a prop. "The car that's been watching us. That was my brother Richard, trying to protect the company's interests." James's voice grew quiet. "But you were the only real thing in all of this. Your kindness, your stories about Mr. Whiskers, sharing your lunch when you barely had enough for yourself." "Stop," Emma whispered. Her hands were shaking. "All those times I worried about you in the rain, all those extra sandwiches I made, you were laughing at me." "No, Emma, never. I gave you my lunch money for coffee," she said, her voice breaking. "I spent hours worrying about where you slept at night. I told you things about my mother, about my life." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought you were my friend." "I am your friend." James reached for her hand, but Emma pulled away. "Friends don't lie about everything they are," she said, standing up. "They don't play games with people's kindness." As she walked toward the door, James called after her. "Emma, please, you're the only person who saw me as just me." She turned back one last time. "No, I saw who you pretended to be. I don't know who you are at all." The evening edition headlines were already being printed. Blackwood Technologies CEO's secret identity revealed. But Emma didn't see them. She was too busy trying to understand how the simple act of helping a stranger had turned her whole world upside down. The next few days were a blur of headlines and whispers. Emma couldn't escape it. Every house she cleaned had the story playing on their TV or spread across their kitchen tables. Billionaire CEO's street performer stunt, the blind man who could see Boston's Beauty the Billionaire. Did you know? Mrs. Henderson asked while Emma cleaned her windows. Did you suspect anything? Emma just shook her head and scrubbed harder, trying to lose herself in the familiar motions of her work. But everywhere she went, James Blackwood's face followed, on magazines, newspapers, TV screens. The man in those photos looked nothing like her Jamie. This James Blackwood wore tailored suits and had a confident smile that commanded attention. In one photo, he stood at a podium announcing some technological breakthrough that would change the world. Her phone kept ringing with numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, probably. She'd already had to dodge several on her way to work. One had offered her money for her story. "Isn't that ironic, Mr. Whiskers?" she said one evening, curled up on her worn couch. "The billionaire pretended to be poor, and now people want to pay me to talk about him." At Blackwood Technologies headquarters, James wasn't faring much better. He sat in his office, surrounded by the luxury he'd pretended not to have, listening to his brother read the latest press reports. "The board wants a public statement," Richard said. "Something to explain your actions. They're worried about the company's image." James loosened his tie. The starched collar felt like it was choking him. I spent 3 months being myself, Richard, just myself. No title, no wealth, no expectations. And I found," he trailed off. "A cleaning lady who now won't take your calls," Richard finished bluntly. "A friend," James corrected. "The only real friend I've had since inheriting this company. Do you know what she told me once? That sometimes being late for the right reason is better than being on time for the wrong one." She wasn't talking about cleaning houses. She was talking about life. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street where people hurried past, just like they used to hurry past him when he sat with his guitar. "I have to make this right," he said quietly. "Jamie." Richard's voice softened. "Sometimes the damage is too deep to fix." But James wasn't listening. He was remembering all the stories Emma had told him about her mother, about her dreams of finishing school, about her struggle to keep her tiny apartment. He'd sat there pretending to be poor while she shared her meager lunch with him. The shame of it burned in his chest. Across town, Emma was starting her evening routine, feeding Mr. Whiskers, heating up leftover soup, trying to study for her online class. But tonight was different. A thick envelope had been slipped under her door. Inside was a check with more zeros than she'd ever seen, and a handwritten note. "Dear Emma, I can't undo my lies, but I can help make your dreams come true. This should cover your education and more. No strings attached, James." Emma stared at the check for a long moment. Then, with steady hands, she tore it into tiny pieces. She didn't want his money. She wanted back the friend she thought she had. A month passed. The media frenzy had died down, though Emma still caught whispers of, "That's her," when she walked through Beacon Hill. The corner where she used to meet Jamie remained empty, its absence as loud as any of the street musicians who'd tried to claim the spot. She kept working, kept studying, kept living, but something had changed. The houses she cleaned felt colder somehow. Even Mrs. Peterson's constant chatter couldn't fill the void left by those morning conversations. Then came the letter from her community college. Emma had applied for a scholarship months ago, long before she'd ever met Jamie. Now, holding the envelope, her hands trembled. "Full academic scholarship," she read aloud to Mr. Whiskers. "But how?" Her eyes fell on the scholarship's name, the Linda Foster Memorial Scholarship, named after her mother. Emma's heart stopped. Only one person knew both her mother's name and had the power to do this. That evening, as she finished her last house of the day, a familiar black car pulled up alongside her. The window rolled down, revealing Richard Blackwood. "He didn't create it," Richard said without preamble. "The scholarship. It was already there, funded by the company's educational foundation. James just made sure your application was fairly reviewed. No special treatment." Emma clutched her cleaning supplies tighter. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my brother is an idiot," Richard sighed, "but not in the way you think. He's been sitting in that corner every night for the past month without any disguise. Just himself. He says he owes you that much, the truth of who he is. I have to go, Emma said, turning away. He's there now, Richard called after her. Just thought you should know. Emma meant to take the tea straight home. Instead, her feet carried her toward their old meeting place. The street lamps were just coming on, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. And there he was. James sat on the same stone step where they'd shared so many lunches, but everything else was different. His expensive suit was crisp and perfect, his hair neatly styled. No dark glasses hid his eyes. No guitar rested in his hands. He was just himself. He looked up as her footsteps approached. Those familiar squeaky work shoes she'd never replaced. You funded a scholarship in my mother's name, Emma said quietly. No, James stood slowly. I found an existing scholarship that you deserved. The committee made their own choice. Why? Because you once told me that your mother believed in helping others without expecting anything in return. He took a deep breath. I forgot that lesson somewhere between inheriting the company and becoming the person everyone expected me to be. You reminded me. Emma studied him, this stranger who wore her friend's face. All those mornings, those conversations were real, James interrupted. The circumstances were a lie, but everything I told you about myself, my fears, my dreams, my thoughts, that was all real. I just didn't tell you about this part of my life. He gestured to his suit, to all the trappings of his wealth. I trusted you, Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. I know. James stepped closer, but still kept a respectful distance. I started this whole thing trying to find someone who would see past wealth and status. Instead, I found someone who taught me that true character isn't about what people see in you. It's about what you see in others. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a familiar paper bag. Peanut butter sandwich, he said with a small smile. Day-old bread, just like you used to bring. Would you share it with me? Not as the CEO of Blackwood Technologies, not as a billionaire, just as James, the man who misses his friend. Emma looked at the sandwich, then at James. In the gathering dusk, with the street lamps casting their soft glow, she could see both versions of him, the friend she'd known and the man he truly was. The question was, could those two people become one? Standing there in the lamplight, Emma looked at the sandwich in James's hand. Such a simple thing, just like that first act of kindness that had started it all. I can't promise I'll trust you right away, she said finally, accepting half of the sandwich. But maybe we can start over, this time with the truth. Over the next few months, James proved himself not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with honesty. He showed up every evening at their corner, sometimes just to talk for a few minutes as Emma finished her workday. He shared stories about his company's challenges, his fears about living up to his father's legacy, his dreams for making a difference in the world. Emma continued cleaning houses, refused to quit her job despite James's assurances that she didn't need to work. My mother taught me the value of honest work, she'd tell him. That doesn't change just because I'm friends with a billionaire. She did, however, accept his help in establishing a scholarship foundation for working students, named in honor of her mother. Together, they created opportunities for others who, like Emma, balanced work and education in pursuit of their dreams. As weeks turned into months, trust rebuilt slowly. Emma learned to see James for who he truly was, not the fake blind musician, not the wealthy CEO, but a man who had lost his way and found it again through an act of kindness. 1 year after their first meeting, James brought Emma back to their corner. The street was quiet, the evening air crisp with early October chill. This is where you first shared your sandwich with me, he said, taking her hand. This is where I learned that true wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in the capacity to care for others without expecting anything in return. You taught me that, Emma Foster. Then, there, on the same stone step where they'd shared so many lunches, James knelt down. I'm not pretending anymore, he said softly. This is who I am, a man who loves you, who wants to spend his life trying to be worthy of the kindness you showed a stranger in the rain. Emma's yes was whispered through happy tears. Their wedding was indeed the talk of Boston, but not for the reasons people expected. Instead of a grand society affair, they held it right there on their corner of Beacon Hill. Emma wore her mother's restored wedding dress, James played the guitar, properly tuned this time, singing a song he'd written about a sandwich shared in the rain. Mrs. Peterson cried. Richard Blackwood gave a toast about how his brother's ridiculous experiment had turned into the best thing that ever happened to him. Mr. Whiskers, wearing a tiny bow tie, served as ring bearer. The headlines this time read differently: Local cleaning lady and billionaire CEO, a true Boston love story. But Emma and James barely noticed. They were too busy building a life that balanced both their worlds, her practical kindness and his resources, working together to help others who needed a chance. Years later, people still tell the story of the cleaning lady who helped a blind man, never knowing he was a billionaire. But those who know Emma and James tell a different story. One about how the richest things in life can't be bought, and how sometimes the greatest love stories start with a simple act of kindness. You know, Emma would say, whenever asked about their unusual love story, my mother always told me that kindness doesn't cost anything, but its value is priceless. Turns out she was right in more ways than one. And James would smile, remembering the woman who'd seen him when he was invisible, who'd taught him that true wealth lies not in what you have, but in what you give.